Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Out and About. Today we're at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance for one of their celebrity lectures. Let's go see what Cindy has for us today.
At this time, I'd like to introduce Tony Chong, a longtime Northrop Grumman employee and a very active participant in one of the many Northrop Grumman model shops. Tony is a renowned photojournalist, and it is my pleasure to introduce him now. Ladies and gentlemen, Tony Chong.
Thank you, Cindy, for the introduction. I titled my talk, Obsessions and Intrigues, The Strange History of the Horton 229. And I say that because there's a lot of really mysterious things about this airplane. When they discovered it, first off, they found it in a Gotha factory, so they thought it was, they called it the GO 229. They quickly found their mistake, at least the Air Force did. Unfortunately, as with most public perceptions, the first name that gets out there is the name that sticks. That runs into that problem a lot, especially in paleontology and stuff like that, where the popular name for something, they find out that it's similar to something else, so another name supersedes it, but the old name sticks. The same with this. Even today, we still find a lot of references calling it the Gotha 229, whereas most people, and especially the Air Force and the Luftwaffe, called it the Horton 229. But the way it got there was very bizarre. Part of it is because the Horton brothers were not a factory. They were not industry people. They were in the Luftwaffe. And they created this whole range of aircraft basically under the radar of their own bosses. So this is where the intrigue comes in, is how they got from doing gliders in the 1930s to producing the world's first all-wing turbojet-powered aircraft is really an interesting story. There were three brothers. There was Wolfram, Walter, and Reimar Horten. They came of age in the 1930s. A lot of changes going on in Germany at that time. The Weimar Republic was collapsing. The world was entering into a Great Depression. The Depression here in the United States lasted until the Second World War. But they grew up very interested in airplanes. And one of the big pastimes for the youth of that period, and especially where they lived, they were born in Bonn, Germany, was to go to the place near the Fulda Gap called the Wasserkuppe. There were a lot of things going on. People think about flying wings, and especially in the United States, they think about Jack Northrop. But there was an awful lot of activity, and when we get to the chart eventually, I put it in there, Aldo knows about this, I put together this chart that showed three timelines. First one for Jack Northrop and all the flying wings and the wings that Northrop and Northrop Grumman have done, or at least the ones we can talk about. The ones that the Hortons did, and then the ones that the rest of the world did. And you can see there's an awful lot of activity. In fact, the idea of a flying wing really began with the beginning of the age of flight. Most prominently, Burgess Dunn aircraft was a biplane flying wing. And so this dream was really much alive. So around the time that the Hortons got interested in aviation and went up to Wasserkuppe, where all of the gliders were being flown. And that was the big center for glider activity in Germany. Because remember, after the First World War, the German Air Force was disbanded. It was illegal. They could only have civilian transports. They couldn't have any military aircraft. So anybody that was aviation-minded went up there and they flew gliders. Well, in 1931, I should start back in 1929, Jack Northrop, of course, produced the Avion, which was his first attempt at a flying wing. It wasn't a pure wing. It had those two thin booms that came out the back. But it was his first attempt at doing a flying wing where all of the major components, the propulsion system, the landing gear, it was originally supposed to have retractable gear, the crew compartment was all embedded in the airfoil of the wing. Well, at the same time, Alexander Lippisch over in Germany was working with flying wings as well. In 1931, he unveiled his Delta I, and the Horten brothers saw this. And they became very excited. So they started building models, as most boys like to do. At least they did when I was growing up. I don't know what they do now, play computer games, I guess. But they started building wings, and one of the things that attracted them was a flying wing design. Now, all three brothers were into this modeling stuff and into the glider stuff. But in particular, Reimar was very, very taken with the idea of reducing drag as much as possible. And in fact, he and Jack Northrop shared this obsession with reducing drag and getting a pure wing flying surface. So very early on, you start to see them build gliders. Now remember, they're still basically in high school and just starting to get out of that, getting a little bit older. And so they're building full-size gliders, and they're building flying wing gliders. And there's a lot of trial and error. They do a lot of models and stuff like that. But they're doing flying wings, and they're doing it on their own. They get people together to help them, but they're on their own. So they get this reputation, and they start getting introduced to a lot of higher authorities. Ernest Udet knew of them, saw their gliders. They started getting more and more noticed by the higher-ups in what became the Luftwaffe. And so they pursued their policies. Well, about 1934-35, they started going into the military. And of course, at the time, no Luftwaffe, so they went into the Wehrmacht. At least Walter did and Wolfram. But the Luftwaffe was created. They immediately switched to the Luftwaffe. All three of them went in. Reimar joined them also. And while Walter went on to take pilot training, and he eventually became a fighter pilot, Reimar got this really cushy gig. He got attached to this base near Cologne, and the commanding officer there knew of him, liked his gliders, and said, well, we're a training base for transport gliders. How about if you make me one of your Horton 3s, and you can do that, and that'll be your job? And he said, okay. Yeah, that was an easy enough gig. So he spent 2 or 3 years building gliders, being in the military, and also starting to go into college for, or university for his mathematical degree at the same time. I wanted to start off with this, and we'll get back to the story of the Horten brothers in a moment, but when American forces discovered this in the Gotha factory in 1945, they were really quite amazed. Now, aviation enthusiasts had heard of the Northrop flying wing and probably suspected that something was up with that, but nobody had ever heard of this. They were just absolutely blown away. Because, let's face it, gliders where they made their name are just not that glamorous for the guys that do powered flight. In fact, Hermann Goering, when he authorized them to build the Horten 229, had never heard of Wasserkuppe and didn't know the activities there. So he was quite surprised. So I imagine when the American soldiers found this, they were really quite surprised too. And so was the technical branch of the Army Air Corps, or the Army Air Force at the time. So they immediately rounded this all up, and again, as I mentioned earlier, that's where you had the start of the misnaming of this airplane, the Gotha 229 instead of the Horten 229. Now, the bulk of the information that I'm using for this talk, and indeed I stole shamelessly the photos, as many photos as I could, out of this book by David Myra. Myra spent a lot of time with both the Horten brothers, the surviving ones, Reimar in Germany and Walter after he moved to Argentina after the war, and spent several weeks with them, talked with them, made notes, and eventually produced this book that essentially told their side of the story. There's a lot of controversy about this book. In fact, there is an awful lot of mystery and confusion as to what the facts really are, and I'm not really sure we'll ever really know what the true facts of the Horton story is. Suffice it to say that there are controversies, and I will try to point them out as we go along. But he was the basis for the book, since he obviously had primary evidence, talking to the actual people. That counts a lot for historians. They always tell you that when you get a degree in history, which I did, is you want primary sources, primary evidence. Now, you do that with a grain of salt. Primary sources, especially after 30 or 40 years, have fuzzy memories. They also have agendas. They also have a lot of other things, which is why you try to corroborate everything with independent primary evidence or independent facts as you can find them. But in the final analysis, a lot of history is subjective. You try to be as objective as you can, but there's an awful lot of subjectivity in that, so you have to keep that with a grain of salt. Okay, there's the timeline that I talked about. Now, the world, what I call the world timeline, is by necessity not complete. And you will also note that I include things that are not just pure flying wings. There is also a part of determining and defining your terms. A delta-winged aircraft is, especially with a tail with a vertical and the control surface, is a semi-tailless aircraft. That, in many people's definition, qualifies as a flying wing. So I do have semi-tailless deltas on there. I do have some other aircraft on there that you wouldn't normally think would be a flying wing, like the Snark, because it doesn't have a tail, and the vertical that sticks up does not have any control authority. So by definition, it would be a flying wing. It just has a real long fuselage. But for the purposes of today, we will try to confine ourselves to pure flying wings, with maybe an occasional vertical sticking up somewhere. As you can see, I'm going to point to the center line. These are the Hortons. And you can see from starting in about 1933, when they did the Horton 1, all the way up until the end of the war, the Horton 229, and even after the war, an awful lot of activity on flying wings. Same with Jack Northrop. Now, he had a gap after he did the Avion. You know, you have to eat and you have to make a living. He was building really cool airplanes with conventional surfaces. He didn't get back to the flying wing, at least he didn't build a flying wing until he formed the Northrop Company in Hawthorne in 1939. Then you can see, and the blue line on the bottom, a tremendous amount of activity in flying wings. They just exploded with flying wing designs, in large part because of World War II. You'll also see that the world was doing a lot of activity there as well. But you will also note that all of this activity, or virtually all of it, stops after Jack Northrop retires in January of 1953. And there's this huge pause in terms of especially pure wing flying wings up until the advent of the B-2. Okay, this is the Avion that I talked about. You can see that it does have the twin booms coming out. He tried to minimize it as much as he could. It came in two versions. They tried a pusher version for a while. They had some problems with that. Then they tried a tractor version for a while. It worked well enough that the parent company of Boeing bought them out, and they went on to concentrate on making alphas and betas aircraft. The alpha utilizing the stressed metal semi-monocoque multicellular wing construction that Jack Northrop used on parts of the Avion. He incorporated that to the Alpha and essentially revolutionized air transport, albeit it was single engine transports, and eventually when the federal government outlawed single engine commercial airlines, that sort of did in Northrop for that. But in the meantime, his airplanes were very well known and very popular, and it kept him busy. Okay, there is Alexander Lippisch. There's his Delta One, which he flew, I believe it was at Tempelhof in 1931. And the Horten brothers were there to see it. They derived a great deal of inspiration out of that. Alexander Lippisch was also one of those guys obsessed by the flying wing and flying wing ideas, although he wasn't a purist in the sense that Jack Northrop was, or that the Hortons were, especially Reimar. He did condescend to have vertical surfaces. But a lot of his would be a semi-tailless delta. And in fact, after the war, he came over as part of Operation Paperclip and did some work for the Convair folks. And his ideas eventually culminated in the XF-92, the Delta, and then of course on to the F-102, the 106, and the B-58, all flying wings or flying semi-tailless deltas. Okay, there are the three brothers. In their youth, and then when they were in military service, except I didn't have a photo of Wolfram in military service because he was killed flying a Heinkel 111, dropping mines in the ocean off France. His plane exploded in 1940 and he was killed. So he's pretty much out of the picture for the bulk of the story, but he is one of the brothers and he deserves to be mentioned. The design on the lower left is one of the designs that they had for their models, and you can see it's a flying wing. Now I threw this map in there because, and now hopefully you can see the red dot. That's approximately the spot where Wasserkup was. It's near the Fulda Gap. The reason I put a map up here is because as I was going through the book and reading this stuff, I was going, where the heck is that anyway in relation to something that I know? So I said, well, if I have this problem, maybe somebody else will have this problem. So I threw a map up there, and you'll see this map reappear with the dot moving around to the various locations where they had their base of operations. But for the moment, Wasserkup is where they are, where they're getting all their glider experience. These are some of the early gliders that the Horten brothers did that gained them their reputation among gliding circles. You can see the Horten 1 up in the upper left, the Horten 2 in the middle, and there was one of the many versions of the Horten 3 on the lower right. The Horten 2 picture is significant because that one eventually showed up in the New York Times and was published. You know, there's often this question of, did Jack Northrop get influenced by the Hortons? Did the Hortons get influenced by Jack Northrop? And the answer is probably yes and no. I think they were both well enough along in their own thinking to pursue what they wanted to do, and they may have been aware of the other person purely from because the students of aviation are aware of things, but to say that one was inspired or influenced by the other, I think is probably stretching it. They were half a world apart, entirely different circles. The Hortons were gliders, and Northrop was powered flight, which is a different kind of beast altogether. So while they may have said, oh yes, there's somebody else pursuing flying wings, I don't think it really influenced them that much one way or the other, at least for now. That will change in 1941. Okay, the war comes. Reimar had gotten into the reserves before the war went out. Of course, when the war starts, he goes back. He again gets this really cushy job where he's with the glider transport group, and he's still working on gliders. Wolfram, unfortunately, gets killed flying the Heinkel. Walter becomes an ace. He gets 7 kills in the Battle of Britain. He is Galland's wingman, the 13th wingman that Galland had. He seemed to run through wingmen awfully quickly. But he was his 13th wingman, and he seemed to stick around long enough to survive being Galland's wingman, which is probably saying quite a bit. That is his BF-109, his airplane that he's sitting on the wing there up in the upper left. That is a Focke-Wulf 190 on the bottom. The reason I throw that there is because during the Battle of Britain, the key catalyst that started the brothers toward the path of the jet wing was the Battle of Britain, because Walter got tired of all of his comrades getting killed by the Spitfires. And he was there when Goering asked Galland, what do you need? And Galland said, give me a wing of Spitfires. Didn't go over very well. He was convinced, whereas others in the military were not, that the Spitfire was the superior airplane, even to the Focke-Wulf 190. In fact, They captured a Spitfire, and he was one of the pilots that flew it. According to Myra, he was the first one to engage in a mock dogfight with two BF-109s, and he waxed their tails, even though he had not had much time in the Spitfire. So it convinced him that the only way that Germany was going to gain air superiority is if he and his brother Reimar designed a flying wing twin-engine fighter. And so he cast about for ways to get this done. And that bottom photo there you can see is Adolf Galland with Hermann Goering. Well, he gets himself transferred and becomes inspector of fighter command. He's one of their technical guys. He basically goes around and checks on the entire industry to see the latest developments, to make sure that fighter production is up to snuff. So he transfers away from JG-26, where Galland is, goes to headquarters, becomes this technical guru, and he says, aha, I have an idea. But before he has this idea, he sees what the latest German developments are. And the latest German developments are turbojet engines. This is the Junkers Jumo Double-Aught 4. Is being tested on the prototype of the Messerschmitt 262. At the time, it was the P1065. Obviously, it's not the final version. This is a tail dragger. They had a little bit of a problem with the exhaust damaging the field and everything, so they switched to a tricycle gear configuration. But he saw the potential there right away. And he said, wow, if we had these in our airplane, this would be really cool, or words to that effect. Well, about this time, he comes up with this idea. And it's where the intrigue and skullduggery come in. While he was doing his inspections, he met this fellow by the name of Arthur Eschenhauer, who was also high up, who was a classmate of Wolfram. So they became friends. And together they collaborated and said, well, have you ever seen that Doonesbury cartoon where Duke is just saying, well, the pension fund was just lying there? They said, well, the Luftwaffe has a lot of these secret command units, the Sonderkommando Luft units. Let's form our own, Sonderkommando Luft 3, in honor of the Horton 3. We'll put my brother inside that unit, and we'll build and we'll specialize in perfecting this flying wing fighter. So they set up this command, totally unauthorized. They sort of siphon secret funds off when they need it to get the men, the material, and whatnot. And they set up their own command in this underutilized airfield in Göttingen. And they start to work. Well, one day, Reimar gets this call from Walter, says, take the day off, you're coming up with me to Peenemünde. So they go up there in October of, I think it's 41, let me check my notes here. Yep, August of 41, when they did the first flight of the DFS 194, they went up there and saw it in October. This was their old mentor in the sense of inspiring them, Alexander Lippisch. He has developed this delta wing airplane that's rocket powered, and out of that design comes the Messerschmitt 163, which was the first operational rocket powered fighter in the world. You wouldn't want to fly in it too often because the fuel was toxic. If you had a fuel leak, it would sort of eat you. But they flew it, and so on the flight home, they're talking to each other, the brothers are, and Walter is saying, this is really cool, but we can't use this rocket, this is nonsense, we got to use these turbojets. And Reimar is saying, I can't believe it, Lippisch has gotten plywood to fly at 600 kilometers an hour or more. Well, if he can do that, I can do that. So right then they say, we are going to make our jet fighter with twin turbojets. And so they cast about trying to find a way to get a couple of spare turbojets. Well, about this time, Jack Northrop builds the N1M, and he makes a patent application for it. And you can see the patent not for the N1M there, but on the right side is a patent application for one of the, it was actually the bomber that the N1M was created to do the proof of concept on. So the big bomber, the medium bomber, I guess is what it really is, twin-engine medium bomber, is what he wanted to do. The N1M was to prove that it would work. So the N1M flies. They do the patent application. Because they're a publicly traded company, they have to make their data public. They do. It gets published in Interavia in late, about October of 1941. Guess who reads it? The German Luftwaffe. And they go, oh my God, this crazy American is doing a flying wing, and look, it really works. So immediately, German industry goes into high gear with flying wing ideas. And this is just a sampling of some of the ideas that came about. The two aircraft up on the upper left, the actual Gotha designs, the P-60B and the P-60C, were, in the Horton's minds, serious contenders to what they wanted to do. The bottom one on the left, the Messerschmitt P-08.01, was a Messerschmitt attempt at doing an America bomber as a flying wing, a semi-tailless. And then the designs on the right were the various design studies that Arado did for their E555. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. They went nuts. Of course, they went nuts in the United States too. There's a brand new book out on Navy aircraft of the 1940s for the USS United States. And if you look through that book, there are an awful lot of flying wing designs by other companies besides Northrop. So everybody went crazy with flying wings. So they moved their operations to Göttingen because it's got room, more room than they had where they were, and it's underutilized, and they can do their operations without a lot of hassle. They did have one scare though. Some auditor came down and said, what is the Sonderkommando Luft 3 unit? It should be disbanded. Stand down. So they said, okay. They went and formed Sonderkommando Unit Luft 9 in honor of the Horton 9, which the new airplane was now called, and just kept right on going. But they complied. Well, anyway, they start casting about for a suitable design. Now, they've had experience with 1 through 4. You can see 4 and up to the upper left-hand corner there. Very pretty design. They also did a powered version with the Horton 5. They did several versions of that. They thought, well, maybe we could do our fighter from the Horton 5. And that evolved into the Horton 7, and you can see there's a model down there. The reason I put Horton 5C/7 is because in the book he has it labeled on one page, the Horton 5C, and then on the very, about 3 or 4 pages later is the same photograph, and he calls it the Horton 7. So I call it the Horton 5C/7 because that was part of the development that was going on. This was the Horton 7 3-view, and you can see that it's developing rather nicely, and it's also looking, like all flying wings do, they sort of look alike. To show how look-alike they look alike, there's a Horton 7 on the right and an N9M, which has flown by then, on the left. And they are quite similar. If you weren't looking for the minor details, you would probably think they were the same aircraft at a glance. Well, what the Hortons were worried about and what the German high command was worried about has actually came to fruition, because not only was Northrop building N9Ms, he built ultimately 4 of them, 1 crashed, but they got a contract in October, November of 1941, a month and a half before Pearl Harbor, to build the XB-35, which was an intercontinental bomber, the 10,000-pound, 10,000 range Mantra. It was to fly unrefueled from the continental United States and to bomb targets in Europe, because at that time they were afraid that Britain was going to fall to the Germans, in the Battle of Britain. And they wanted to be able to strike Germany if they needed to from American bases. And this airplane and the XB-36 were the two designs chosen to do with the long-range bomber testing. So the German fears were there. The United States, very heavily into strategic air power, was building a strategic bomber that could strike them, and they had nothing that could do it. Well, the Hortons keep plugging along. They keep refining their design. This is one of the early design standards for what they call the Horton 9. And there's the second design study. You can see that it's starting to evolve a little bit. You can see that the engines are located at the leading edge in this particular design. But they said, well, we want to do something else. Let's go a little bit further. You can see that in the initial V1A design, the inlets are not on the leading edge. They are underneath the lip of the leading edge. And in fact, I'll try to point that out with the, you can see it right there. Now, there's been some speculation, especially with the building materials that they were using. They were, of course, using a plywood, but the adhesive apparently was a wood chip and resin mixed with carbon in it. And there was some speculation, well, did they do this for stealth? My own personal opinion is probably not. They probably weren't even aware of it. I don't think that they would have been unhappy if they were less likely to be picked up by radar. But at that time, I don't think it was a big concern of theirs. I think they were more concerned about getting a glue that would stick together and their planes wouldn't delaminate. They already had that problem with a few of them. At least the Hortons did. They had to burn a couple of their designs because it just came apart. The engine they decided upon was the BMW 003. And they went and talked to the people there because they had this top secret, because to get around the auditors, and they were never bothered by auditors again, which is an indication of how badly the war was going for Germany if the auditors couldn't do their job. And B, how clever they got. They started stamping all of their correspondence top secret, General of the Air Force, so nobody dared question these. They discovered that in Nazi Germany, nobody questioned orders. So they never got bothered by an auditor again. It did lead to a problem, though, which we will touch upon later, because the BMW production of the 003 was pushed back considerably. They had to push the production to the right because Albert Speer wanted them to produce their regular engines because they had a high demand for their airplanes. They said, come on guys, crank it up. So they pushed back the engine. But anyway, this is some photos that show the early stages of the Horton V1, 9V1, they did manage to get 2 engine shells of the BMW 003, so they were able to build their airplane around it. Now remember, these guys are still basically going to college, that they've been interrupted by military service. They're bright guys, but they don't have turbojet experience. They're building this airplane around a couple of engine shells and hoping that it will fly. They don't have access to wind tunnels. They're flying really by the seat of the pants. Well, they decide, we probably really should do some sort of testing to get some parameters on controllability, et cetera, et cetera. So they decide to build the Horton 9 V1-B, which would be a glider. And you'll note, if you look at the bottom drawing there, it's got these 2 huge fairings because it was fixed landing gear. You can see the construction that's going into this. The airplanes were essentially welded steel tubular structure for the main body, and then with spars, wood spars on the outside with a plywood covering. And the plywood, of course, was that treatment that we talked about. Well, there they roll it out, and you'll get a couple of views of the airplane here. It's very pretty design, very elegant. It would be very hard to see. Of course, it's even harder to see in this one because there are no engines sticking up. But it's still a very sleek-looking design, and so they go out and they do their tests. The test pilot is Heinz Scheintauer. He has considerable glide. In fact, he met the Hortons at Wasserkup. So he's up there flying, and he gets a job with them flying their 9V1. And they discover, and something that has plagued a lot of flying wings, this thing has a little bit of a Dutch roll. And so this debate emerges. Well, what do we do about the Dutch roll? Well, Reimar's going, absolutely no verticals. This thing, we'll fix it, we'll damp out the oscillations. And Walter's going, well, you know, we want to get this thing produced, so maybe we should stick a vertical on there. It's, no, we're not going to have a vertical. So this argument rages. But in the meantime, they proceed with their the V2 concept incorporating the BMW engine. There's a nice little cutaway there. But they start looking at alternative designs. Now there's two reasons for that. One, this request has come up for a Volksjager, people's fighter, and so they said, well, maybe if we just stuck an engine on the top like this and made it really cheap, we'll call it the 9B, and it'll be our people's fighter. This first one incorporating a vertical surface. Now, I don't know if this was the design sensibility of the time in Germany, but if you look at some of the Junkers designs, some of Alexander Lippish's designs, especially on the DM1 and some of the later Lippisch DM15 and whatnot, they all have this triangular wedge for a tail surface. The cockpit's sort of fared into it, and they have this thing sitting there. It's sort of big, but that's what was one of their designs. Well, around March or May, Hermann Goering gets so tired, and this is in 1944, Hermann Goering gets so tired of being presented with the same type of design from all the industry. They were looking for an advanced fighter. He was getting these twin-engine fighter concepts, and he says, enough of this. Our fighter-bomber concepts. He says, enough of this. I want a leap in technology. I want you guys to do a 3x1000. I want an airplane that can go 1,000 kilometers an hour. I want an airplane that has 1,000 kilogram payload. And I want an airplane that has 1,000 kilometer range. And the industry said, oh, okay. Well, the Hortens over in Sonderkommando Luft 9 are going, hey, you know, that paper you just drew up the 20 pages on the specs on the Horton 9, maybe this would be a good time to present it so we can come out of the black, you know, because how are we going to spring this airplane full grown like Athena from the head of Zeus if nobody knows we're here? So they say, that's a good idea. So they conveniently leave out the fact that they've been working on it for 6 months and present it to the Air Ministry, which takes about 6 weeks to circulate it among the experts and other people to make sure that I'm not going to present a wild, crazy idea to Hermann Goering and have my head bit off or worse if this is a stupid idea. So it takes about 6 weeks to get vetted, and they said, okay, you got an appointment. So they go in, present it to Goering, and he loves it. To even make the pot sweeter for industry, he was offering a $500,000 Reichsmark prize, or sorry, 500,000 Reichsmark prize. And so after this presentation by the Hortons, where they tell them all about Wasserkup, what they had never heard of, and he tells them all about what they want to do with the airplane, he says, you guys go build me one. I want to see one flying in 6 months. And they go, well, we can have a glider flying in 6 months. Do it. And he turns to Erhard Milk and says, give them their check. So he goes away, and so he says, so who do I make the check out to? And Walter goes, can you wait a minute? So they run out and they incorporate. They are now a legitimate aircraft company, which they weren't before, and they can actually cash the check. Well, everything is going hunky-dory until they finally realize you can't get the BMW engines. You just can't get them. There ain't no way. How about taking a Junkers Jumo double-out 4B? Okay. So they get the engine in. Oh my God. It's about 20 inches longer and about 7 inches wider in diameter than the BMW. How did this happen? Well, it's because you were a Sonderkommando Luft 9 and you weren't on the distribution list saying that there was changes of the engines. So now you have two good engines, but they're bigger than your airplane. Well, that means we can't have fully embedded engines. It's going to break up the lines and everything. Yeah, but we only got 6 months, so what do we do? Well, what you do is you look at that upper left picture there, you split the fuselage or the wing root, you widen it, you sort of fare it in as best you can because you don't want to waste all the time that you did, and you rebuild the darn thing. You just make it wider and sort of a little bulgier. So that's what they did. Again, on the upper left picture there, you can see the welded steel tubular construction. And on the other photos, you can see how they were skinning the wings and all that sort of good stuff. Well, we're getting close to the end of actually having an airplane. There is your 3 view. You can see it's a little bit bulgier. The inlets, if you look at the center drawing, the inlets are now in the front, breaking that clean line. Also for stealth, you got those engine turbines spinning out there like a beacon, but I don't think they were worried about that then. But there's the airplane. It's getting on towards the end of 1944. Well, about this time, some B-26s pay them a visit and drop about 18 airplanes worth of bombs on their factory in Göttingen. They miss, but it puts the fear of God in them, so they move their factory up to Minden. You can see they were down here, right around here. They moved up there. Well, that took some time. Remember, they only got 6 months to get this thing flying. Well, it's finally ready. It's finally ready to fly. They got a pilot, Lieutenant Irvin Ziller, who had experience in twin-engine jets. He's flown the ME-262. Their normal test pilot just only flies gliders. This is a twin-engine jet. He can't fly this thing, so they have to get Ziller. Ziller's so green in this airplane. If you can see that picture there in the lower left, Ziller is sitting in the cockpit. The crewman is by there pre-flighting the airplane, starting the engines and everything, because he knows how to do it, Ziller doesn't. So he's in there starting everything up, and he's going to back away slowly, and then Ziller's going to take it up. Well, they finally do. They go to Oranienburg, just outside of Berlin, to the airfield there, and they fly it there. The first flight is a success. So you can see on the map, the little red dot, there's Berlin, there's Oranienburg right there. That's where they did the flight tests. And there it is flying. It flew for half an hour on its first flight. I think, if I recall correctly, got up to about 450 knots, about 5,000 or 6,000 feet, came down, landed. Everybody was just happy. It's Christmas, 1944. The Battle of the Bulge is going on. Germany only has 6 months left. So they finally get the airplane in the air. So they break for Christmas. The Hortons say, we'll be back. We have a little pressing business. You go on ahead. Do some test flights, but make sure that there's somebody in the control tower that knows what's going on. Because Ziller, you're still a little green. This is the production version, or at least getting closer to the production version. This is the airplane that was found by the Americans. It's now called the Horten 229 V3. V is the prototype designation. You can see you can actually see the cannon fitted on there. If you look at the top picture, those little protrusions there are the two 30mm cannon. Well, what has kept the Hortons from getting back to the flight test was a little call from the German High Command, specifically, gee, your flying wing looks really swell. Do you think you can make an America bomber out of something like that? And they said, I guess so. So they came up with the design. This is the first design here, the Horten 18A, 6 BMW engines. Sleek looking thing, very pretty, wingspan of about 155 feet, very close to the 172 feet of the XB-35. I'm sort of wondering where the heck they're going to put the payload, because as you notice in the drawing there, the upper left, those are the 6 engine inlets there. It means the engines are in the body there somewhere. There's your exhaust. Where do you stick your bombs? Well, you're going to carry a nuke. You don't care. This was a nuclear bomber. Germany had a nuclear program, and this is what they wanted. They wanted an airplane to go to New York and back because they wanted to bomb New York. Never mind the fact that all of our aircraft manufacturing and all that sort of stuff is in the middle of the country on the West Coast. We're going to bomb New York to show those Americans that we mean business. Well, they liked the initial idea. They said, okay, let's get somebody more experienced. Let's get the Junkers folks in. So Junkers came up with this thing with a vertical. And Weimar says, I will not have a vertical on my airplane. So he goes back and he makes the 18B. Well, this is taking, they're into February now. Well, something happens on one of the test flights, and this is where part of the thing is. The airplane in most books says it had 2 hours of flight time on it. Myra says that that was 2 hours official time. There were also flights that were not logged, so who knows how many flights they had on that thing. You know how those early jet engines were, that a lot of maintenance. This was a shoestring operation. Remember, they weren't even incorporated 6 months earlier. They were Sonderkommando 3 or 9. Well, something happens. Ziller takes off. He gets airborne. He has a flame out on one engine. Tries to bring the airplane around. If you notice on this top photo here, this is a photo that Myra took in 1990. There's a berm there. Well, normally, you would clear the berm, then you would pop your landing gear and do a landing. Well, somehow, Ziller popped his gear before he reached the berm, which created so much drag, he just went down. Crashed the airplane, destroyed it, killed himself, and the Hortons were aghast. You know, that was our only prototype. What are we going to do? Well, it's February, guys. You know, it is time for the end game. This is the little red dot there. Is where the the Gotha factory is. The German High Command was pressing on until the very end. In fact, some would say that they were somewhat delusional. There's stories, of course, of Hitler moving divisions that no longer exist. The German High Command is purchasing airplanes that they will never finish. They asked Gotha and Klemm, two different manufacturers, to go into production on the Horten 229. Then they say, okay, no, let's do it this way. We're going to make the Horten 7 the trainer for the 229. We'll call it the Horten 226. Klemm, you build those. Gotha, you build all the 229s. So they started building them in their factory there. In April of 1945, the Americans overrun it. The Hortons are captured, and so are the remaining airplanes. This is some of what they found. They were doing not just the fighter, but they were also doing a night fighter, they were doing a strike aircraft. The drawing that you see on the upper left, if I can get this pointer to wink, that's a two-seat version. That was going to be a night fighter. Put on some Schlager music cannon and some Liechtenstein radar or whatever they were using at the time, and you can go up and have a good old day or night, except they never got it finished. You can see they had a nice supply of UMO 004B engines there. And you can see that they were well along on building the remaining, I think they were going to go up to V8 before they actually went into the production A1 versions. And that's where the war ended for the Hortons. This is what the Americans found. This is what the Americans took the United States. They took a couple of the Hortons. They took 2 Horten 3s, a Horten 4B, and a Horten 6 V2, plus the Horten 229 V3. Now, Myers calls this Wright-Patterson, Wright Field. It hadn't been a Wright-Patterson yet. They didn't merge until 48. However, other sources say, no, that's not quite right. There were 3 different designations. The first one was when they were actively testing, that'd be a Wright-Pat. If they were being restored, it was going to go to Freeman Field in Indiana. And if it was long-term storage, it would go either out to the desert, Davis-Monthan, or to this Oak Park facility up in Chicago, what is now O'Hare. So the Horten actually ended up at Freeman Field and then later at Oak Park. So it never made it to Wright-Patterson that I could find, but it did eventually end up at the Smithsonian when Paul Garber came through and said, let's take that out of the weather and put it into our nice little facility. We'll have a nice little airplane. Some more of what the airplane looked like in those days. You will note that in the pictures that were taken in the factory and at Freeman Field, there is No swastika there. Swastikas go on vertical surfaces. There is no vertical surface on this thing. I'm not quite sure where they would have put it. I don't think they would have put it there where it eventually ended up when somebody painted it either at Oak Park or at the Smithsonian, because there is a swastika on there now, at least two, one on each side of the center line, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to put your national marking in your exhaust trough. So, I'm not sure they would have put one on at all. Now, there was a story circulating that Northrop got to examine the 229 V3. No, they did not. They examined the Horton 6 V2 and two of the Horton 3s, or at least they looked at them, because when they arrived at Hawthorne, they were so badly damaged, they basically said, well, there's nothing we can do about the Horton 3s, and we'll just look at the Horton 6 and not fly it. Even though the Horton 6 V1 flew, they did not fly this. And they actually did produce a report, of which there is a Xerox of the cover page of that report there, and I have read it, and they talk very non-committally about the Hortons and how it was built, and they don't talk about flying because they didn't fly it. For those of you who like stats, and I admit I'm like that once in a while, this is the statistics or the measurements on the the Horton V1, the V2, and the V3. And there was some interesting facts there. 54-foot span. The V3 went up to a 55-foot span. It would have been a pretty airplane. Well, what did the Hortons do after the war? They wanted to come to the United States. In fact, they wanted to work for Jack Northrop. But, and this is the part I can't verify, Myra says that Northrop said, these guys are glider guys. They don't know anything about powered airplanes. Why would I need them? Not knowing, of course, about the 229. Most people didn't know about the 229 because for most of the popular press, it was the Gotha 229, not the Horton 229. So, according to Myra, Northrop passed them up. So, Weimar goes back to Germany, goes back to school, and Walter says, well, you know, there's this opportunity that's being offered to me by Perón's people down in Argentina, so he went to Argentina. He built more flying wings. And he built flying wings up until the 1960s, and this was one of his last ones. It's a big thing, the IE-38. It flew, and because Argentina was experiencing hyperinflation in the 1960s, it was not built. And so he eventually retired and died in the early 90s, at the age of 90. Of course, I had to throw in Jack Northrop because he is the other part of this story. I've already mentioned Alexander Lippisch. Jack Northrop went on, converted the XB-35s to the YB-49, the YRB-49, which in a quick look has an awful lot of resemblance to the 18B that Weimar came up with those big things hanging down, except for Weimar, those big sponsons had 2 engines on either side of it and 4 main gear in the sponson, which were retractable. So it was like, it was flying on stilts. Well, after 1953, flying wing development pretty much dies at Northrop. And after the Hortons get through with playing with their thing in Argentina, it dies for most of the world too, until the early 80s. It was resurrected by Northrop. In 1989, 20 years ago this year, we should all remember that, the B-2 rolls out. And it is the confirmation of both of the obsessions of Jack Northrop and the Horton brothers of a pure flying wing. This is what remains of the Horton 229 V3 in the Smithsonian Garver facility now. Oh, the question was, how was the Horton 9 V1 glider version gotten airborne? I don't know the type of tow aircraft. I'm sure if I read through the book more heavily, I could find out. But
it's in the video, I think.
Is in the, oh, well, no, that's the Horton 2.
Oh, okay.
We do have a video clip of a Horton 2 for one of its flights. If anybody's interested in seeing it, we could fire that up, I suppose. There is, the beginning of this was taken off of YouTube. And there's a guy on there that goes by the handle Bomber Guy. And he's got a lot of really neat videos. So if any of you are prowling around on the internet, look for Bomber Guy under YouTube. There's all sorts of neat stuff. This has some narration because part of it is an actual newsreel. So it did get publicity. I mean, it was shown to U.S. and British audiences. And so it's coming up now. He starts off with some pictures of the aircraft before he goes into the newsreel footage.
A German airman is trying out his novel machine at Cologne. It is in effect a pair of rigid wings without body or tail. Towed aloft by another plane, this machine flies under its own power if necessary, but it's been tested for stability, so it glides. A striking picture of the machine in flight before a faultless landing on its single wheel completes a successful experiment.
Basically, the narrator is talking about the fact that German aviators going up in this flying wing, and of course flying wings were quite the novelty, and they still are. He says it's a very successful flight coming around for landing, and it's a beautiful looking airplane. The Horton 2 was very nice.
Did you see that cut from that descent to the, I wonder what they cut out in between there, you know?
Yeah.
That was a pretty
You also notice that the landing gear did pop down as a single wheel, and it had a skid too. Usually a lot of the Horton aircraft, the pilots flew prone. They were semi-prone position. They're sort of like leaning forward over and doing the controls. And that's why if you see the cross sections of a Horton vehicle from the top, it looks very elegant. From the side, it looks very weird because you have usually a faired part that comes down where the pilot's lower body rests. And that's where the skid is integral to that. And then the gear pops out from elsewhere. So it has a very strange side-on aspect, but it's a beautiful, beautiful looking design for these guys, and considering they were pretty much self-taught. I mean, they did go to school for mathematics and stuff, but these guys were pretty much self-taught and they had no wind tunnel access at all. Did an amazing job. Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Seniors Out and About here at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance. I'm Betty Wheaton. I'll see you next time.